Welcome. It's now 4:15, so we should be starting. Welcome to a special session of the international workshop at Tel Aviv University. Get the right papers on the table. Sorry. So we are here in a special session of the international law workshop of Tel Aviv University Law School. And this is a special session, which is, as you know, a roundtable on topic of COVID and international law and human rights, or as we called it, long COVID. About a year ago, pretty early in the pandemic and pretty early in the era of webinars and Zoom, we organized within the international workshop roundtable on the topic with other speakers, and we decided a year later to go and to revisit the questions of international law, human rights, and COVID-19 now from the perspective of we use this pan long COVID. Are we, as Kim Sledge said, all in this together? Of course, it's a fantasy that we all talked about, but is this true? And what do international law and human rights tell us about it? I will just say to our many guests that we are very happy to have you all. We are actually meet during this term every week here in the international workshop, and you're welcome to join us for other sessions, which usually focus on one speaker and one paper. Today, as you know, we have four speakers, so I will not to take too much time because we only have 90 minutes. I will introduce briefly our speakers, and really briefly because each of them has a long biography. So I'll just give some highlights. And then each of the speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. And then we will have time for discussions and question and answers. We have the students who are registered in the workshop, and then we have other participants who can join us later. So a new earphone, so I didn't even cut this thing. It's all a bit new here, getting back to the university office after not being here for 1 year. I will introduce briefly our speakers, and I will just mention for those of us who haven't joined us before that we have here my colleagues Eliav Liblich and Natalie Davidson that we convene the workshop together. So our first speaker, the first one will be Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. Dr. Mofokeng was appointed in July 2020 as a special rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. She's a medical doctor with a lot of expertise in advocacy for universal health access, sexual and reproductive health rights, and more. So she has a lot of experience both as a doctor, but also as an advocate, and now as a special rapporteur, and also as a commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality in South Africa. After Dr. Mofokeng, we will have Professor Gian Luca Burki, and he's adjunct professor of international law in the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and also works on the cooperation between Geneva and the O'Neill Center for Global Health Law in Georgetown, and the joint program they run, LLM program they run, and Global Health Law and Governance, of which he's a director. He also has a lot of experience in practice. He actually was the legal counsel of the World Health Organization. Um, and in that capacity, he has actually been worked on the revision and the implementation of the international health regulations. And he has also before that worked in the Office of the Legal Counsel in the UN. And and he's written extensively on the topic, and he's also the co-editor of the Research Handbook on Global Health Law and many other articles. After Professor Burki, our third speaker will be Dr. Melanie Levi, or Professor Melanie Levi. She is actually professor at University of Newcastle in Switzerland, but also teaches here at Tel Aviv University in Israel. So we're very lucky to enjoy her too. And she teaches on health and human rights and researches on health and human rights. So she will be the third speaker. And the last but not least will be Dr. Marco Longobardo, who is a lecturer in international law at the School of Law at the University of Westminster, expert in public international law, especially laws of war, jus ad bellum, and international humanitarian law, and also international criminal law, and specifically has written quite a lot on the law of occupation, which he will be also addressing today. So those will be our four speakers, and I would like to, without further ado, to invite the first speaker, Dr. Mofokeng, the UN Special Rapporteur, as we said, on the right to health, to be the first speaker. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this invitation. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. And welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues. It's really a great honor to join you this afternoon. Is it good morning or evening from wherever you are joining us in the world? And of course, I am the current mandate holder on the right to health, which is a very important right that contains both freedoms and entitlements. Freedoms include, but are not limited to, the right to control one's health and the right to information. And the entitlements include the right to the underlying social determinants of health that provides equality of opportunity for people to enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. Now, this right exists along the rights to reproductive health, bodily integrity, safety, and security. And the right to health is a right that has to be fulfilled not only if people meet certain set criteria, but a right that has to be fulfilled, protected, and promoted for no other reason but because people are human beings. And COVID-19 is showing us that even at our best as a global health community, we were never prepared. For example, COVID-19 specific testing capacity, access to treatment, and a lack of consistent supply of clean water, crucial for the prevention of the virus spread, continue to be structural deficiencies. And the pandemic continues to highlight these structural fault lines, and that there is currently inadequate resourcing of community health systems, biomedical development, especially in the global south, and public health information dissemination globally. And many health systems have failed to provide adequate supplies of personal protective equipment to healthcare professionals who are for many years the backbone of already fractured and ailing public health systems. And the anxiety and the trauma that the healthcare and allied health professionals are experiencing is unprecedented. And for how long can they offer quality care if they themselves are experiencing rights violations and abuses in the workplace and continue lack of urgent occupational health and mental health support makes the situation very dire on the ground. Globally, as of today, there have been 140 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, including more than 3 million deaths reported to the WHO. And this disease continues to prove more deadly than anticipated, while the world carries on facing cumulative and interconnected health, economic, social, and human rights crises it has unleashed. Inequality shapes the structural and systemic challenges borne unjustly by individuals, and it's through differential access to healthcare and underlying determinants of health, socioeconomic and other structural factors interact with each other to generate and reinforce negative health outcomes that disproportionately affect certain people in our communities. And we know that in any situation, the disproportionate negative impact affects those who are already in vulnerable situations. We must be vigilant to policy changes that lead to further marginalization and violations of rights of people in vulnerable situations who are often neglected from health services, goods, and facilities, including women, disabled people, older persons, internally displaced people, persons in crowded settings or residential institution, people in detention, those who are experiencing homelessness, migrants, refugees, and those of the LGBT and gender diverse persons. Morally and legally, differential access to necessary healthcare in the midst of the worst global crisis in a century is unacceptable. For example, the WHO, more than 308,000 Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory have tested positive for coronavirus since 2020. And the WHO has also reported more than 3,200 deaths related to COVID-19. And infections and deaths have been rising steadily. And we have to remind and underscore the importance of the Fourth Geneva Convention, that Israel is required to the fullest extent of means of available to it to maintain health services in the occupied territory. And Article 56 requires Israel to adopt and to apply the prophylactic and preventative measures necessary to combat the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics in cooperation with national and local authorities. It has been over a year since the COVID-19 pandemic first took hold of the world, and as the Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, I have produced numerous interventions and in collaboration with my colleagues, cautioning global leaders and businesses against the use of market solutions and nationalism to facilitate preferential access to technologies for combating the COVID virus and preventing mass deaths. And it is disappointing to say that very few of our recommendations, cautions, and advisories have been heeded to. And since the possibility of a COVID-19 vaccine was presented, vaccine nationalism among wealthy developed nations has dominated negotiations around the procurement, which has directly impeded the ability of developing low-income countries to procure vaccines in sufficient quantities to protect their citizens' health and to restart their economies. I continue to reiterate that the right to health, which during these times is directly linked to an accessible, affordable, acceptable quality vaccine, is a human right after all. And these elements of accessible, affordable, acceptable, and quality health services are fundamental key elements and principles to public health. The emerging intellectual property disputes over patents, as well as the possibility of having oligopolistic manufacturers, could also hinder the development and production of COVID-19 vaccines, as well as the availability, accessibility, and affordability of vaccine at national and international levels. And pharmaceutical companies have responsibilities regarding the realization of the right to health, and in particular, in relation to access to medicines, including vaccines. And in order to protect the right to health, states should use to fulfill the provisions in the agreement of trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which is commonly called TRIPS, and regarding flexibilities to protect public health and provide access to medicines for all. And of course, we understand that the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and public health, and following the commitment made in the Sustainable Development Goal 3, it is important to ensure that we provide flexible, TRIPS waivers at the moment, although they may be temporary, but it's very important to ensure that there is vaccine equity. And of course, the human rights mechanisms have provided extensive guidance on this issue, especially for private businesses and states. Among other recommendations, we have come down to the obligation that all stakeholders have to first and foremost protect human life in the discharge of their respective mandates. And it is very important and a matter of ethics and basic humanity, which should be an uncomplicated matter. But ethics cannot exist in the context of a global system of governance predicated on deeply unequal hierarchies, which sort of the importance of human lives based on race, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, and health and wealth. And to discuss ethics in the context of COVID-19 is to bring into question the ethics of the systems we have participated in until now. And some of these systems are oppressive, and they reinforce and coexist to cause more marginalization and vulnerability. Friends and colleagues and distinguished guests, it bears repeating that during this time of global distress, which has shown states, healthcare systems, and society at large to be unprepared, no one can succeed if everyone is not protected. And the obligation to provide access to essential medicines is a core minimum obligation of the right to health, which means that such access should be prioritized. In conclusion, it's through solidarity and cooperation, and it is the only ethical and viable course of action which can achieve success in the fight against the pandemic. And despite knowing what should be done, we have also been faced with serious questions about true commitment to protecting everyone's human right to one of the most basic needs, physical and mental health. For states to fulfill their obligations under human rights law, in particular the right to health, there must be sustained effort by all the governing authorities with common goal of a comprehensive vaccination program which reaches everyone in the world, including between Jordan and the Mediterranean, on the basis of equality and best practices that the prospect to defeat of the pandemic will be possible. The right to health is also a fundamental human rights issue. And international human rights law stipulates that everyone enjoys the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much for those remarks, which I think put on the table the really important issues. So now we will move on to our next speaker, to Gian. And
I'm here.
yeah, I just want, yeah, you can start. I just want to, yeah. Uh, okay. Welcome, Gian. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayala. Thank you for inviting me, and good morning, afternoon to everybody. Ayala has asked me to talk a bit in 10, 12 minutes about the sort of legal aspects of global health security, which is a very ambitious goal. But anyway, I'll do my best at least to give you some of the basics, because that's an area of international law that is not terribly well known. It only becomes mediatic and interesting at times of crisis, and then you don't have the detachment to really analyze it carefully and more objectively. So first of all, let me front load the main problem that is here with us and that will remain with us until things change qualitatively at the level of international law and international politics. The main problem is that the world is chronically unable to prepare and cooperate for major disease outbreaks. It was 160 years ago, it remains today. And as COVID shows, it's not a question of development. Some sub-Saharan African countries are faring better than Western European countries. So there are other dimensions at stake. And so what does that mean? That means that there is an undeniably an increasing frequency and gravity of zoonotic diseases. Most of the diseases that have been concerning us come from animals, wildlife and livestock, one after the other. And so there is a huge problem there that is not addressed, in particular of the linkage between the health agenda and the environmental agenda. And also that we saw after the H1N1 pandemic, after the Ebola outbreak, like a wise person said recently, the world seems stuck in a cycle of panic and neglect. Panic, and then when the outbreak ends, we forget. Politicians have a short attention span. And so here we are facing this challenge that will definitely play out in the next few months, because there are several important political appointments in 2021. The Health Assembly, G7, G20, UN General Assembly, and so on. So what are some of the main features that you should know? The system of global health security clearly revolves around WHO. It's not alone. That has to be a team effort, because crises of the magnitude of COVID go well beyond health and address, as the Dr. Mofoken clearly explains, basically all aspects of human life. But WHO is at the center from a public health perspective. As you know, WHO is bigger than just the control of infectious diseases, but this remains, if you want, historical core of an organization that was built on a previous legacy of other organizations that were largely focusing on controlling epidemics. WHO does a number of things, but the main legal normative coordination instrument that it manages is the International Health Regulation, IHR. And I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about that in the last 14 months or so. IHR that we have on the shelf now was revised in 2005. but it is the latest manifestation of a long tradition, a long legacy of international rules on control of epidemics that goes back to the end of the 19th century. So those concerns are still valid now as they were more than 100 years ago. The revision in 2005 has created, and I confess my bias because I was the legal counsel of WHO at the time and part of the secretariat team that worked on the revision. So I couldn't say they're a total failure for obvious ego reasons, but actually objectively they are not. They are an instrument that reflects the globalization of risk in the 21st century in a modern way. First of all, we always apply them to COVID kind of situation, but they apply to any event that can spread disease internationally. A nuclear accident, an act of chemical terrorism. So it has a strong political component and brings it very close to the international security agenda. It's a dynamic instrument based on a joint risk assessment and risk management between WHO and states. It's not a static thing. It has some fundamental obligations for states that I think during the revision, states underestimated how demanding they were. What we call core capacities, basically to have a health system that can prevent and control these kind of shocks. Not just the airport or the port, but the healthcare system. And this has been, I think, a major failure during COVID. But also, states obviously have fundamental obligation of good faith and cooperation, what people reproach China not having complied with, to assess outbreaks, to communicate with WHO, to continue to communicate in good faith, basically transparency, solidarity, and good faith. WHO has a very strong managerial role. One striking features of the IHR is that basically states are delegating the whole management of the emergency part, so to speak, to the Secretariat and taking a step back. So WHO is co-responsible, of course, for surveillance, for detection, for assessment, for giving alert, for guiding, trying to guide soft coordination, up to the famous public health emergency of international concern. The case of COVID was declared at the end of January 2020, like the highest level of alert. So at the same time, the IHR politically embodies what people have called a grand bargain. Basically, states have said, WHO, we like how you operate. We don't want to politicize health crisis. You go and manage fundamentally the system of alert and emergency, but we state retain the final word, the final authority to decide on national measure to protect the population. And that's exactly what happens. We've all, had lockdowns at home, travel restrictions, trade restrictions, and so on. Sometimes we could say they were compliant with the IHR, most of the time they were not. And there's a minimum amount of accountability for states. So there is little deterrent at not imposing sometimes excessive measure. That's a weakness of the IHR. WHO obviously does more than just managing the IHR. After Ebola, that was an existential crisis for the organization, member states set up an emergency program, operational emergency program, the first in the history of WHO. And under that, WHO has sent plane loads of reagents for testing kits, of masks, of protective equipments, of ventilators, of spare parts to many, many developing countries. That's been an unsung role of WHO in the last 14 months, but I think it has made a difference. So there's also this operational aspect, if you want. What has COVID shown? COVID shown a number of limits and weaknesses of the system of health security revolving around the IHR. And very briefly, these are some of those in my opinion. The first is the system of alert. Either we have an emergency or we don't have anything under the IHR. So states underappreciated the complexity of health crisis. And there is a lot of discussion to replace this emergency, the sky is falling, but there's only that, with a more incremental, more nuanced system of alert. The second is the clear failure of states to live up to their obligation in what we call the core capacities, basically to bring up the public health and healthcare systems to a level of preparedness and control. And again, that's not just a development issue. It's privatization, it's unequal access, it's discriminatory access, it's the irrational choices in public health and healthcare. I'm Italian. The health system of my country is supposed to be one of the best in Western Europe. It imploded in a matter of weeks. That should give big lessons. The third is a lack of an accountability mechanism. As I said, there's no reporting system, there's no real accountability that you normally see in most multilateral normative treaties. The fourth is the dependence of WHO on states. Again, we go back to the reproach against China and to the reproach of WHO of being too differential, too dependent on states. But these are, as you know very well, the limits of international organizations. So there is a lot of debate on whether and how to strengthen the authority of WHO, in particular at the outset, at the very onset of the crisis. It can make the huge difference whether controlling an outbreak or being in the disaster that we are now. And finally, that IHR was not equipped to be an instrument to leading and driving a sustained response to a long crisis. IHR has disappeared in the narrative of WHO. I was monitoring the website daily. WHO itself didn't mention the IHR for months. So it has a narrow scope and clearly not what we need to drive a response to this kind of crisis. So what do we need? What is the talk right now? What is happening? And I'll finish with that. First of all, there's a lot of debate, which sometimes is very tactical, frankly, and very politicized, about how do we strengthen the system of global health security? Should the IHR be amended? If there are design flaws, shouldn't we fix the design? How do we strengthen WHO? But also, we need something more. And there's a lot of debate about negotiating and concluding a new, what we call pandemic treaty. That's something that was proposed initially by the European Council. The Director General of WHO has clearly supported it. There was recently an op-ed published by 25 heads of states of government. So there is a growing momentum to almost, I would say, sidelining or parking the IHR. They are weak. It's okay. We'll negotiate something new. And maybe it's a good idea. My concern is that it seems like a very quick, very tactical initiative where basically we say we have a window of opportunity, we need something new, let's go for it, and details will follow. Because there's not much clarity on what this pandemic treaty should do and why shouldn't the IHR be strengthened to do some of these things. But that's, I think, an important point in the conversation during this year. There is a clear lack of prevention at a zoonotic level, as I said before. And that's an interesting gap between environmental law, like biodiversity, CITES, desertification, that remains more upstream, and public health law, like the IHR, that is downstream. Basically, once the disease has started, you have a blind spot there. That is where the zoonotic spillover happens, and it badly needs regulation. And so far, I haven't seen much discussion on that. And then we need a clear investment by states in their own health systems. We need to resolve this dichotomy between opposing rational choice exercises, between nationalism and I take care of my population first, which is not an illegitimate concern for political leaders. But at the same time, we only go out of this together. And so we have this dichotomy that needs some pragmatic reconciliation. And maybe this treaty will be one of the tools to achieve this reconciliation. And finally, we need financing. We need a clear new financing model. The development model of financing doesn't work to finance health system, doesn't work for surge capacity in a crisis, and so on. So there is a lot of talk about different models, about innovative financing, about a bottom-up approach that involves public-private partnerships, not just the usual suspect like the World Bank, and so on. So there's a lot of things moving on. And so let's hope that they go in the right direction, because fundamentally, if we fail this test, we are sitting like lame ducks waiting for the next pandemic, and that's not acceptable. So I'll stop there. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ian. And I'm now giving the floor to Melanie.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Eyal, Eliav, and Natalie for inviting me to participate in this roundtable discussion. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here and to join all of you in this timely debate. In my time slot, I would like to go through a few what I would call revelations on health and human rights in COVID-19 times. And so I would like to start with a quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was an influential figure in British intellectual and religious life, who died end of last year. And so he described the COVID-19 crisis as the nearest we have to a revelation for atheists. And I think this comparison really captures well the biblical sense of shock that many of us felt in the face of such a sudden and extreme crisis. And I think Rabbi Sachs' comparison with Revelation still seems fitting today, but for a different reason, and one I think that matters for thinking about a world of long COVID. The current crisis is alarming in part because it has several new and unfamiliar features, a global medical emergency caused by a virus that we still do not fully understand, an economic catastrophe as a necessary policy response to contain its spread. And yet, I think as time has passed, it has also become clear that much of what is most distressing about the current crisis is not new at all. On the contrary, the pandemic, I think, revealed existing weaknesses and inequalities. The crisis then is a revelation in a far more literal sense. I think it is focusing our collective attention on the many injustices that already exist in how we live together. And so just as the virus found and exploited pre-existing medical conditions in individual bodies, so the pandemic found and revealed pre-existing weaknesses in the body politic, in health, economic, and political systems, exploiting and aggravating them. And so I would like to talk here about two such revelations in the context of health and human rights and the right to health as protected by Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and interpreted by General Comment 14. So the right to health includes, of course, states' obligations to respect, to protect, and fulfill both with regard to access to healthcare and also social determinants of health. And it is both of these areas that COVID-19 really has revealed different rights violations. The first revelation, I think, relates to healthcare systems. The pandemic has brought to light the deadly toll of a lack of public health infrastructure in many highly medicalized healthcare systems in many countries, including high-income countries. Healthcare infrastructure and personnel could not sufficiently absorb a hit such as this major pandemic. And there are two events, I think, from the very beginning of the pandemic that illustrate this realization. First of all, I don't know if you still remember the satellite images coming from China showing how they built a huge new hospital to treat COVID-19 patients within a few days to absorb the shock and lack of healthcare infrastructure. Another revealing sign, I think, was the short-sighted discussion about respirators. COVID-19 is a respiratory disease, so we buy respirators to assure access to treatment. And there was this unbelievable frenzy at the beginning with which states bought respirators all over the world, sometimes on the black market at horrendous prices. Here in Israel, it was actually Mossad who became involved in this enterprise. And what happened with these hundreds, thousands of respirators in Israel as elsewhere, they're stored in hospital storage rooms, in army hangars. There's simply not enough specialized trained healthcare professionals to operate these machines and hospital rooms to put them in. And so I think this is something that really lacked during this pandemic, health professionals and sufficient healthcare infrastructure, which is able to accommodate all the patients. What good is access to a respirator if no one is there to actually operate and surveil it? According to Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, of course, infrastructure and trained personnel are part of the human right to health, yet many countries have not been unable to operationalize their right to health to enable available, accessible, acceptable, and good quality personal protective equipment, diagnostic testing, and healthcare services. Health systems are more fragile than what we thought, even in high-income countries. And so COVID-19 has really illustrated to many countries, I think, that their health systems are struggling to withstand a prolonged health crisis. A second revelation that appeared more recently is what I would call the vaccine paradox. In a very short period of time, remarkable research and development has been done. However, there's a stark contrast between, on the one hand, the scarcity of vaccines and questions of inequitable allocation access on a global scale, and on the other side, increasing debates about mandatory vaccinations to overcome vaccine skepticism in high-income countries. And of course, the human rights implications regarding vaccines on these two sides of the medal are very different. The absence of a system that secures equitable access to vaccines has uncovered deep failures, I think, in the global governance systems for health with regard to two dimensions at least. First of all, the interaction between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. Access to COVID-19 vaccines is dominated by a stunning lack of global solidarity. High-income countries have been securing access to vaccines for their populations only through advanced purchase agreements with pharmaceutical companies in clear disregard of their obligations of cooperation, of assistance guaranteed by international human rights law and the right to health in particular. Numerous countries today have not received a single dose of vaccine rollout through COVAX. The global alliance to distribute vaccines to poor countries has been delayed and is insufficient. In Europe, for example, rising COVID-19 cases and a slow vaccination campaign has prompted vaccine export controls, and we see the same phenomenon also, of course, in the US and the UK. On a global scale, we are still talking about limited charity from high-income countries in favor of low and middle-income countries, even in this context of the COVAX initiative. And I think we're very far away from states considering vaccines as a global public good, which should be fairly and equitably available. What has also been revealed during the current pandemic is the political use of vaccines in the form of vaccine nationalism and also vaccine diplomacy. As an example, here in Israel, Israel was set to transfer vaccines to states who supported it by moving their embassies to Jerusalem, for example, Honduras, a move that was later stopped. And also domestically in Israel, there has been a back and forth with vaccine rollout to migrant workers, to prisoners, to asylum seekers, to Palestinians. And of course, we have seen the political use of vaccinations in the context of the occupation. I think this is something that Marco will talk about later on as well. Finally, the battle of scarce vaccines against COVID-19 highlights, I think, the role of private actors such as pharmaceutical companies and the lack of legally binding mechanisms that hold market actors accountable for failing to act for the public good and protect human rights. The particularity with vaccines, as with other drugs, is that violations of the right to health and unequal access are created and reinforced not only through state actors, but through the power of private actors such as pharmaceutical companies who produce and sell the vaccine, who have the patent, the skills, and the know-how. The human rights obligations of private actors is something that the health and human rights framework has very much allowed to put on the center stage before. For example, at the very beginning of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and this is something that is revealing itself again with COVID-19. Another issue is the interaction between access to vaccines, human rights, and international trade law. Here we see a conflict of rights of a different order. States such as India and South Africa have called for changes to intellectual property laws in an effort to speed up global vaccine manufacturing. The focus here is on a proposal for a temporary waiver of certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement, allowing to suspend patent protections in relation to COVID-19. This move would allow generic manufacturers to make more vaccines. However, the proposed waiver has been met with considerable opposition, of course, from high-income countries, and discussions on this topic are still ongoing. In addition, making patents available might be an empty gesture here. The problem with vaccines is having the infrastructure and the human capital to know how to make these vaccines, especially in the context of the new mRNA vaccines, such as the ones produced by Moderna and Pfizer. And here, even in many high-income states, there is just not enough manufacturing capacity and also know-how skills, human skills, to produce these vaccines, as for years vaccine production has been ignored and abandoned by both pharmaceutical companies and states, in clear contradiction to states' obligations under the right to health. And so today, again, we realize that vaccine manufacturing and distribution infrastructure is the major roadblock in the current vaccine rollout. I would like to conclude with the other side of the vaccine paradox. When we talk about the right to health, we usually talk about states' obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to health by providing access to essential medicines such as vaccines. And then we realize that in many high-income countries, I'm mainly thinking about Europe here, people do not want to get vaccinated. In this context, we currently witness vaccine skepticism and discussions about incentives for vaccination and even mandatory vaccination. Here in Israel, this of course relates to the green passport, which gives preferential access to certain venues such as restaurants, but also universities and in-person teaching. And there are obligations to be vaccinated or undergo frequent testing in many other high-income countries as well. And so this part of the vaccine paradox, of course, relates to the public health versus individual liberty dichotomy. How do human rights relate to vaccine skepticism and mandatory vaccination in the very special, grave circumstances of the current pandemic? This debate, I think, will be played out in the courts, and it already is. I just want to attract your attention here to a very recent decision from last week of the European Court of Human Rights, which had to analyze the compatibility of mandatory vaccination with the European Convention on Human Rights. The Grand Chamber decision in the case of Wawrinka versus the Czech Republic had been widely anticipated and was delayed due to the current pandemic. Eventually, the court backed the Czech Republic in its requirement for mandatory childhood vaccinations. In this landmark ruling, it found that while the Czech policy certainly interfered with the right to private life, it pursued the legitimate aims of protecting health as well as the rights of others. And there are certainly many more litigated cases in domestic contexts that will follow here. Finally, and with this I will conclude, when talking about health and human rights in a post-COVID era, I think we have to also think about the long-term consequences and impact beyond COVID-19. How do pandemics end? Pandemics typically have two endings, the medical, which occurs when the incidence and death rates plummet, and the social, when the epidemic long-term social effects wane. And in the context of health and human rights, we can clearly see that COVID-19 is rolling back years of progress. Some scholars refer here to the concept of a shadow pandemic threatening health-related human rights and deteriorating social determinants of health. Examples here are lockdown-induced disruptions, delays, for example, of childhood immunizations, of non-COVID-related healthcare treatments, such as cancer treatments, limited access to mental health services, limited access to abortion services, as a clear attempt to limit women's sexual and reproductive health rights. The securitization of public health in the current pandemic tends to violate individual liberties, neglect social and economic rights, and contradict eventually the core principles transcending all human rights of equality, of non-discrimination, and of cooperation and assistance. By now, I think it is clear that the initial narrative of the COVID-19 virus as a faceless equalizing force that would infect the rich and the poor alike is wrong. COVID-19 is in reality a social X-ray that reveals the fragmentation and social inequalities within and between societies and the health systems that are supposed to serve them. This is where the human rights work, I think, will have to pick up and intensify once the most immediate battle against COVID-19 is behind us. We have to start looking beyond the tyranny of the urgent, which guides the security-led responses to disease outbreaks. And so the restrictive handling of civil rights and liberties in the early months of COVID-19 needs to give way to a more balanced and orderly approach. And of course, the pandemic has clearly shown the need to reinforce social rights, such as the right to health, in its basic aspiration to guarantee a functioning health infrastructure. How will the end game look like for this pandemic? I think from a human rights perspective, there is no end game here. To quote the wonderful scholar Alicia Yamin, overcoming the uncertainties of the present moment requires an understanding that the history of human rights has always been and will continue to be a story of struggle. And I would like to add here of accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that Gian asked for the reference for the European Court of Human Rights judgment, but Eliav already put it in the chat window. So thank you for mentioning it. And as I mentioned,
finding the link, by the way.
Thank you. And as I mentioned before, Melanie teaches health and human rights in our law school. And I teach global health law, and we have another colleague teaching course on Israeli health law. And together we are developing this area. And actually, this event is also sort of a precursor to a law and health program that we hope to launch sometime in the next few months. So within the law school to bring together the courses and the research done on this work here. So I'm very happy that we, as I said, have Melanie with us, and thank you for this great talk. And I will now give the stage to Marco.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure being virtually with you. Honestly, I would have been happier to be physically with you. I saw that you have a great weather and you got a huge degree of immunization in Israel. So I really envy you. I'm stuck in Italy where the situation is getting somber and somber every day. And today I'm asked to talk about the law occupation. I have to confess, as you may be aware of this, that in the big scenario of this pandemic, the law occupation doesn't play a big role. There are far more important issues to discuss, and the speakers before me touched upon some of them, except for those regions of the world where a situation of occupation exists. And usually when I talk about the law occupation, at the end of every presentation, somebody in the audience complains that some occupying power around the world doesn't do what they say the occupying power should do, doesn't follow the rules. So I'm very happy that Professor Burci has already warned the audience that the rules on the pandemic, the applicable rules of international law to the pandemic, hasn't been followed very much, not only in occupied territory, but also outside occupied territory. So, which is the starting point? I'm gonna just providing you with the legal framework. You are students from the University of Tel Aviv. I'm almost sure that you can apply very well that legal framework to the occupied Palestinian territory, but potentially this legal framework is applicable to other areas and the occupation around the world. And the starting point is that in the past, pandemics, diseases were a very likely occurrence in times of armed conflict, and states were very happy if the enemy territory was affected by a pandemic. The Iliad, at the beginning of the Western literature, starts with a plague in the Greek encampment, and the Trojans are very happy, and they decide to launch what they thought would have been the final attack against the invaders. Things changed. Over the time, things changed, even if armed conflict and pandemics can go along. and sometimes they happen together, the law of armed conflict tried to tackle pandemics. And specific rules exist in occupied territory. This is interesting from my perspective because listening to experts comparing COVID-19 to the Spanish flu, I learned that during the Spanish flu, governments were not so much focused on fighting the pandemic. They had other problems. And I heard experts saying this is a demonstration that today governments are more concerned with the healthcare and well-being of their citizens. And this is important if compared to the situation of occupied territory, where a government is dealing with the enemy citizen, not with its own citizens, with the local population of the occupied territory in a situation that is inherently hostile. There is an armed conflict ongoing. You know, a situation of occupation is a portion of an international conflict, even if sometimes it lasts for a long time. Many decades, such as in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory. So it was necessary maybe to place an explicit duty upon occupying powers to fight pandemics in occupied territory, to avoid that a state could use that pandemic as a good way to get rid of the enemy, basically. And in fact, in the law of occupation, we have explicit provisions that have been mentioned by the special rapporteur before me about the duties upon the occupying power. I would like just to remind the audience that first we should think about the umbrella obligation of every occupying power in the world, that is Article 43 of the 1907 Hague Regulations, that says that an occupying power has the duty to restore and ensure as far as possible public order and civil life. And we have significant practice, including the Supreme Court of Israel, that says that civil life of the occupied territory encompasses the right to health and health infrastructures. However, apart from this umbrella clause, there is a very explicit provision in the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention on Epidemics. I have to say this is one of the less explored rules of the Fourth Geneva Convention, at least before COVID, and it is Article 56, according to which the occupying power, to the fullest extent of the means available, has the duty of ensuring and maintaining, with the cooperation of national and local authorities, public health, healthcare infrastructure, with particular reference to the adoption and application of prophylactic and preventive measures necessary to combat the spread of epidemics. So in Article 56 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, purely law occupation, we have an hard law duty to fight against an epidemic like COVID-19. And Iliad was so nice to cut and paste the text in the chat for everybody. Thank you. And this rule is important because it's fully applicable to, for instance, to the population of the occupied Palestinian territory. I would like to draw your attention on the fact that the fight against COVID must be done with the cooperation of national and local authorities. This means that under the law occupation, the responsibility is first placed upon local authorities. And I love that Article 56 mentions both national and local authorities. This means that this rule is applicable whether you think that Palestine is a state or whether you think that Palestine is not. It is not important. The fact is that the occupying power must cooperate with the local authorities. And the law occupation is built in this regard as in layers, in strata, according to Professor Distein, in the sense that if the local authorities are not adequately provided with tools to fight against the pandemic, the occupying power has the duty to bring in within the occupied territory medical goods. This is established clearly in Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, that says, to the full extent of the means available to it, the occupying power has the duty of ensuring medical supplies. So you see, which is the idea, and for the friends here, I remember, okay, I will say this later. So you can imagine which is the idea. First of all, the local authorities of the occupying power must try to address the pandemic. If they are not enough, there is a duty upon the occupying power to cooperate and to bring within the tools to fight against that. But this is not enough. If not, notwithstanding all of this, the occupied territory is not able to fight against the pandemic, there is another rule of the law occupation that is always, it's Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention that places upon the occupying power the duty to allow medical supplies to enter the territory. So first duty, local authorities. Second duty is cooperation of the occupying power, the duty to bring in medical supplies. Third layer, the occupying power must allow states and international organizations acting for humanitarian purposes and in an impartial way to bring in the instruments. This is the basic of the law occupation on the fight against COVID. And it will be a good exercise for you to try to apply these principles to the situation, for instance, of the occupied Palestinian territory. Just to say a few things, also because facts change quite quickly in this regard. At the beginning, there was some cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel, but the same, and this was lauded, for instance, by the UN, by many bodies of the UN. However, very, very soon, it appeared clear that the occupied Palestinian territory doesn't have the capacity to vaccinate, to fight against COVID first with preventive measures and to vaccinate the local population. And so all the times that you hear some politicians saying it's not our responsibility as Israel, you must be aware that that's wrong under international law, because Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory is the occupying power. And similarly, you may remember that some weeks ago, there was on the newspapers, you have read that there was a stock of Sputnik vaccine from Russia that was delivered to the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel blocked that. Again, you should be aware that this is illegal. In fact, then it was allowed into the occupied Palestinian territory. Well, this is just a very basic scenario. It's a very basic scenario because it doesn't take into account the role of human rights law. As mentioned by Melanie, Article 12 of the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights deals with deals with the right to health. And this is a provision that has been considered to be applicable in occupied territory by the International Court of Justice, referring to occupied Palestinian territory. And this is important because this rule helps you to deal with the question, could the government of Israel vaccine only Israeli citizens in occupied territory? And the answer is not. It cannot be, the vaccination cannot be done in a discriminatory way. And finally, since I'm talking with a mainly Israeli audience, I know that it's very often there is the argument that with the Oslo Accords, the so-called Oslo Accords, responsibility for the vaccination has been transferred to the Palestinian Authority so that Israel doesn't bear that responsibility. This is only partially correct. Why I say it's only partially correct? Because it's true that the Oslo Accords ask the Palestinian Authority to keep going with the vaccinations in place in the occupied territory. But they provide for a duty upon the Palestinian Authority and Israel to cooperate for the vaccination. And then in any way, under Article 47 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, no agreement between an occupying power and the local population can derogate international humanitarian law. So we cannot interpret in any way the Oslo Accords as lifting the responsibility of Israel for the vaccination of the local population of the occupied Palestinian territory. A final note, because I don't have any more time. As the special rapporteur reminded, as very often said by WHO personnel, nobody can think that he or she can be safe against COVID unless all the world is vaccinated. This is particularly important for situations in which situations of occupation. It is impossible, medically impossible, to think that the occupying power can vaccinate its own population and that and this will prevent the spread of variants from the occupied territory. Being so closely linked as occupied powers and occupied people are, means that the potential of the contagion is huge. So it's in the interest of an occupying power, either in the Middle East or in the Caucasus or in West Africa, to vaccinate at the same time its own population and the people of the occupied territory. It's not only a matter of international law, it's not only a matter of human rights law, it's the only way for the occupying power to get rid of the COVID-19. Again, I'm open to send lots of challenges how this works in practice, but just to let you know, in the UK, we are unable to challenge the mandatory quarantine in hotel that is illegal under the international health regulations, whereas in Israel, there is a pending challenge before domestic courts for the lack of vaccination in occupied Palestinian territory. So maybe this time international humanitarian law will be implemented quicker than other branches of international law. I don't know, we will see. Thank you very much, I welcome questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the speakers for the great contribution and also for standing in a very short time frame. We have apologies from Dr. Mofokeng, the special rapporteur, who could not stay for the discussion, unfortunately, because of other commitments. But we have the three other panelists, and we have just a little bit under our half an hour. So this is time to open the floor for discussion and question and answers. Please use the raise hand function. We have our students who always get some priority, but everyone is welcome for Q&A and any comments or questions they want to put. So I'm please welcome to start. I already see 2 hands that are raised, so 3 actually, 4 already. Okay, now just because we have I'm running less time than usual when we have 1 speaker, so I want you to ask a question pretty shortly. So just ask you focused questions, and I ask, and then we'll ask the people to address them. So Lisa, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Also, thanks to all the speakers today. I have a question for Professor Burki. You talked before about the new pandemic treaty spearheaded by the EU. And I was wondering, given the current tensions we see during COVID-19 between various countries, for instance, the US under Trump and China, do you think this new pandemic treaty actually poses the risk of like a regional or divided approach to pandemics, so that we lose this universal approach we had under the international health regulations because we will never be able to reach this same level of agreement? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Great question. Gian, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Excellent question. And it's true. This is broader than Europe, and I think there was a show of solidarity in this op-ed that was published a couple of weeks ago, signed by countries all over the world. But clearly, some of the big players are not committing themselves. The United States has already said that they dread the idea of sending yet another treaty to the Senate, since they basically can get nothing out of the Senate for years and years. I wonder how true it is. To me, it's largely technical. China and Russia are for the moment very defensive and clearly not very enthusiastic at assuming new obligations, in particular China. So there is a risk. There are several risks. One risk is that these are railroaded as a Western exercise, with all the baggage of possible neocolonialism and health security that protects the rich countries and sacrifices the poor countries. And that would be a tragedy. The second is that this becomes a very watered down exercise with a treaty at the end of the day, very, very general, that doesn't really have a bite. And the third, as you said correctly, it can lead to more political divisions. But I see very anecdotally some appetite anyway for say, okay, the absolute priority is to improve our security as individual countries and as groups of countries. If there are recalcitrant states that because of their own nationalistic, populistic attitude don't want to go along, we can start with sort of a club approach with a group of countries that will at least create a safe, more or less safe area of the world in terms of communication, preparedness, coordination for response, and so on. And the rest will join if it's possible. I think it will be very short-sighted because it will increase division. But that's where the conversation is at this time. It's still a very preliminary stage. Some of the big players, like again, the US, China, Russia, but also India, also Brazil, have not taken a position. So I think a moment to test the viability in general terms of this idea will be at the Health Assembly, which will be at the end of May. I know this is on the agenda. There is already a push to launch negotiation there and then for a WHO treaty. I don't think it will be so easy, but it will be the moment to test at least the political viability of this idea. It could be also one approach among others. I would see positively the beginning of an intergovernmental process, because you need to bring states together beyond the confines of the European Union or these small ad hoc groups, and talk about what kind of normative political instruments we need for the future. So without obsessing on the treaty, that could be one element of a menu to address global health security. But as I said, I think there will be several testing moments during this year.
Thank you. Dana, please, you're next.
Thank you all for talking here. It was very interesting. My question is towards Professor Melanie Levi. Towards the end of the conversation, you mentioned about how we backtracked a lot because of the COVID-19 in other areas that we've had certain advances. And this was very interesting to me, and I'm wondering normatively, how are we going to go forward from here? What have we learned from COVID-19 that could be utilized moving forward, let's say with any other violations of human rights that are maybe not even caused by actions, but by lack of action from different states? What could we change moving forward?
Thank you very much. This is an excellent question, highly relevant, of course, thinking about long COVID-19 and the sort of legal responses that we can build to not only prevent, of course, future pandemics, but also, as I said in my talk, to try to come back to what we lost over the last year. And of course, here, I mean, the few examples that I mentioned, for example, access to abortions, this is certainly something that we've seen in the US, for example, where access to abortion has been excluded in many states due to the fact that abortions were not considered essential healthcare services. So what we've seen there is that access to abortions was excluded based on somehow rational or objective arguments saying, well, there's not enough personal protective equipment. It's not safe for healthcare professionals. It's not safe also for patients who come to the hospital during a pandemic to have an abortion. Of course, all these sort of certainly rational, but also superficial arguments have been used for political reasons to create obstacles for women to have access to abortion, and thus I think creates considerable violations of sexual and reproductive rights. So your questions, what can we learn from this to move into another direction? I think it's difficult because in many instances what we've seen from this sort of securitization of public health or health security approach, it actually goes with other phenomena that we've currently seeing, where nationalism, populism, that is pushing certain traditional pursuits or traditional values, and of course this also transpires within healthcare systems. So again, this I think it's very concerning, and I'm not quite sure what the way forward is there. Another area, of course, that we've seen is cases of domestic abuse, for example, violence against women that has increased significantly due to lockdowns, due to being confined at home, for example, with violent partners, family members. And there again, of course, during the pandemic, there has usually public health authorities in states have created special hotlines, for example, for distressed women to sort of report domestic violence even during the pandemic. But still, I mean, this is not a proper solution or long-term way forward. So this is certainly very concerning. Maybe a last point or a more positive note, I want to go back to talking about vaccine skepticism. So again, this is another phenomenon, sort of increasing fears again with regard to vaccinations. And there, I think we have to distinguish. Of course, there are parts of communities who are skeptical towards vaccination. They're sort of just anti-vaxxers based on principle. They do not want to get vaccinated. On the other side, we see a lot of marginalized communities, minority groups who, for historical reasons, are skeptical of public health messages telling them to go and get a vaccine. In the US, for example, many studies showing that African Americans are very skeptical of the COVID-19 vaccine due to historical research misconduct, misuse of African American participants in clinical trials. Of course, there again, we see that this is a huge challenge that we have to address on a long-term basis, both on a domestic level and of course also globally. And there, for example, maybe to conclude with a positive example of action that is taken on a global level, the WHO recently created a health behavior task force or technical advisory group thinking about how to use behavioral sciences to push for health behavior. And they actually appointed Cass Samsin as a very world famous expert on, and not just on, creating incentives for pushing certain messages. And so I think this is certainly a very interesting and positive development. WHO trying to use health behavioral sciences to actually work towards a better managing of a next pandemic.
Thank you. Tamar, go ahead.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing these really insightful thoughts. I want to build on this previous question and direct it to both Professor Boshi and Professor Levi. We have COVID-19 happening in parallel to other pandemics that particularly affect the global south. And what we're seeing is that the COVID-19 response had an adverse impact on the ability to fight those other pandemics, both for direct reasons, movement restriction and others, and for indirect reasons, such as funding and resources. minimum core approaches within human rights law and the core capacity in the IHR were both criticized for legitimizing and obscuring issues of vertical inequalities. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think we can try to utilize or strengthen or amend these frameworks in order to promote the right of health in an equitable way, and not reflect these legacies of colonialism and past discrimination?
Who wants to go first? Gian, Melanie? Gian, you want to go first?
Very quickly, you ask a huge question. Obviously, the security discourse is inevitably dominated from the north. In a way, the securitization of health historically was led by the United States in response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, because they saw HIV/AIDS as potentially creating huge destabilization in sub-Saharan Africa that would touch the strategic interest of the US. And I think the discourse continues from there. So it comes with a lot of baggage of being a fundamentally imperialistic agenda. So as long as health is seen in security terms, it's difficult to get rid of that more than suspicion, I think, of that superstructure. I think there are 2 points there. First of all, the health security aspect, so the international health regulation, what WHO does, if we have a pandemic treaty in the future, can go a long way, in my view, in rectifying or creating at least a political space to rectifying some of these inequalities. If you look at the proposals for the future, there are 2 aspects that continues to come up. One is prevention of zoonotic risk, the other is access to vaccine and other countermeasures. Because even the most nationalistic or the current nationalistic states realize that this is untenable as a strategic approach for the future. So obviously there can be a lot of rhetorical aspects there, and as you can see, the power of the pharmaceutical industry comes out of this crisis strengthened, if possible, not weakened. And so the lobbying on certain countries will be intense. And so I don't think we can be too wildly ambitious. But I think we do have a window of opportunity to address some of the most glaring aspects of inequality. And probably the first to go will be downstream, will be contingency arrangements for scientific cooperation, for research and development, for manufacturing capacity, for technology transfer, and for allocation of countermeasures. And here I think we have some leaders from the global south. Unfortunately, Brazil with Bolsonaro has disappeared, yeah, literally. But think of India, Thailand, South Africa, Chile, it has become a lot of leadership, Mexico, and so on. So I think we can see a certain level playing field in future negotiation to rectify some of the problems you're talking about. And obviously, there are systemic inequalities that are so ingrained that it will take a lot of challenge, a lot of effort to even start redressing them.
Lenny, you want to add something?
Yes, just very briefly. I think this is a highly critical and important question. In my talk, I refer to the tyranny of the urgent, of course, that allows states to limit or impose important restrictions on liberties, but of course, on a global or international level, this tyranny of the urgent created by COVID-19 also creates a reorientation of focus, of attention, and eventually funding from other infectious diseases that are maybe more prevalent in the global south towards the fight against COVID-19. So of course, in terms, again, of health inequalities, this creates a huge problem. However, and since this is something that is closely connected to my own research, of course, we're not only talking about infectious diseases. The WHO, even though this is much more recent, but the WHO is also dealing with non-communicable diseases such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, all these non-communicable diseases that are mainly created by certain individual behaviors, civil society diseases, as we call them, and all these non-communicable diseases that eventually lead to obesity, etc., and all the associated health problems. Even though we think that this is a high-income country, Western world problem, actually it's not. Also, non-communicable diseases are mainly present, are predominant in the global south. And there again, we see, of course, that this refocus, reorientation and, of funding within the WHO from also the fight against these non-communicable diseases towards the fight against COVID-19, of course, highly affects the global south.
Yes, and we often talk about the double burden of disease in the global south.
Exactly.
So yeah, so because we only have about 10 minutes, I want to take now in two pairs. So we're going to have Pedro and Eliav first pair, and then Chanel and Itai, and I'll ask again, I have to ask you to keep the question short and then the answer short. So Pedro, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone for the wonderful presentations. One question from Gianluca Borti. So you mentioned that one of the key aspects missing from the current regime of international health security is how to guarantee access to vaccines. And can you imagine then that in the upcoming discussions, there will be a need to somehow address the intellectual property regime as well? So, considering that even if we discuss a new treaty on pandemics, could we really work our way around the obligations of states under the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights? Or how could we then strengthen this, think of mechanisms to enhance access to vaccines at the international level? Thank you.
And Eliav, and then
Yeah,
we'll...
I think I'll defer to Chanel. I'll go the next round, okay?
Okay, so Chanel, go ahead.
Thank you so much again for all speaking today. So my question pertains more specifically to Professor Berkey, but anyone's more than welcome to answer it. So, I mean, as we discussed, there's a general consensus that the World Health Organization's authority is pretty limited in nature, which is why we see a lack of conformity. But one of the issues in granting more authority to the World Health Organization and the IHR is that states have a significant role in the decision-making process of issuing fake declarations. So I was wondering how this issue would be tackled, and just how we could deal with the implication of like granting states more authority indirectly by granting the World Health Organization more authority as well.
Jan, you want to answer those two questions briefly, if possible? Thanks.
Yeah, very briefly. So the first, Pedro's question, obviously this is a bit uncharted territory. I personally doubt that there will be the political will to somehow have a massive waiver of intellectual property rights. It's too ingrained in the economic model of the pharmaceutical industry, and it will be very difficult. You can see how WTO is locked at the moment in this futile debate on the South Africa and India proposal. The question of access, of improving access, was discussed in WHO about 8-9 years ago. And part of the proposal was to have almost like obligatory minimum contribution by each state, both to research and development nationally, but also to a pooled fund, so pooling resources, and then have a system of centralized system of priority setting that does not displace the market, but tries to act where the market has failed. And clearly, pandemics and crises are a moment of market failure. And so there can be like a correction or parallel systems that require a lot of public money injection that will allow states probably to work around the question of intellectual property, that to me would be, if not untouchable, almost untouchable. The second question, there is an Israeli professor that I admire very much, Eyal Benvenisti, who has written an excellent article on the American Journal about bringing, actually, he didn't go so far, that's my extrapolation on his argument, bringing states back into the management of health emergency. Because as I said, IHR are managerial instruments, everything is delegated, everything. A lot of power is delegated to the secretariat, but does an international secretariat have the kind of political traction? Can it really address question of political cooperation, where you have deep division of priorities and politics? So I think there is strong arguments, even the design of the management of international health emergency should be reconsidered. The states should be brought back closer to the management, not obviously interfering in every single thing, but providing closer oversight, allowing a forum to discuss big issues that now there is no forum to discuss, for example, in public health emergencies and so on. So I personally would advocate that approach. It has its risks, but also the current situation has its risks.
You want to address a second question, or that addressed both of them?
That was the second question.
For both, right? Yeah, that was second, right. That's true. You addressed both, yeah, intellectual property and the states. Sorry. And now I just want to call on Eliav and Itai to be the last pair. Eliav, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so my question is for Marco. I was wondering, what's your take on how to assess the point in which you can say that the local authorities have no capacity to do it themselves? Do you do that in comparison to what happens in the territory of the occupying state itself? Because what we have in Israel is this completely extreme situation that the occupying party is managing a very successful rollout in its own territory and then completely neglects its obligations in the occupied territory. So then you have this type of basic inequality, but we know that occupation law doesn't require to equalize between the territories. So what's your take on this?
And Itai.
Thank you, Eyal, and the speakers. And I think this is building on what Eliav has just asked. So this is addressed to Marco. The argument presented to us by Israeli officials was that in this apportioning of responsibilities to provide the vaccine, national authorities, Palestinian authorities, have not formally requested Israel to provide. This may be factually correct. However, legally, isn't the occupying power obligated to assist through its own means, the capacity, the capability of local authorities to provide? Thank you.
Thank you both, and they're interesting questions. I will start with Itai. I think this will be an interesting case, one of the very few limited instances in which we can apply the law occupation against the authorities of the occupied territory. That is a very limited, it doesn't happen usually. What I would say is that from the text of the Fourth Geneva Convention applying the relevant interpretive criteria, I don't think that there is an obligation of the occupying power towards the occupied state, and so that the obligation is triggered by a request. Rather, the duty is placed to protect the local population. In fact, the Article 56 mentions national or local authorities. If we remember that Article 6/7 that is common to the Fourth Geneva Convention says that even the beneficiaries of the rights enshrined in the Fourth Geneva Conventions cannot renounce them. I think that legally speaking, the lack of an explicit request by the local authorities of the Palestinian territory is not that much relevant. Clearly, it has a huge impact as a matter of politics. And in relation to Eliav's question, I'm totally against comparing the level of anything in occupied territory with the level of anything in the territory of the occupying power. It sounds like the litmus test suggested by Dinstein for altering the occupied territory. But I think that in this case, using, for instance, the reports of the WHO, using the reports of UN bodies, in particular of UN bodies concerning with the protection of human rights, such as the Human Rights Council, the various special rapporteurs that asked Israel to intervene to provide vaccines, we can easily assess, we can easily confirm, we can easily conclude that the occupied Palestinian territory are not sufficiently supplied. But thank you, Iliad, for clarifying that it's not they are not sufficiently supplied compared to Israel. They are not sufficiently supplied to fight COVID as such. And that's the legal test. So I think that in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory, is particularly striking the contrast with the occupying power, but this is not, legally speaking, the correct test. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Ayim. We are actually just almost out of time. So I want to thank all of you and all of our speakers and the students and the other people who participated. I think that we are left with many open questions that came up. I mean, I wrote a few notes, and I don't want to us to go beyond the time, but I think that Gian and others mentioned the gap between the environmental law and public health law, and today we hear more and more about the One Health approach and about the need, if we want to actually address not only the symptoms, but also there was a report from the United Nations Environmental Agency in July, I think, saying that we are addressing the symptoms of the COVID, but not the root causes. So I think that's one challenge that at least I hear that we need to think further about. And another one is what came out in some of the questions, some of the discussion, how to overcome those colonial legacies that the securitized model in a way reproduces, and the tyranny of the urgent, which Melanie mentioned, also reproduces, because urgents for whom we know that many people continue to die for endemic diseases in certain countries which are not considered a public health emergency of international concern, but they continue to be endemic to countries in the global south. So I think we are left with those challenges, and then the challenges of how do we need a new treaty, or do we need to work within a new version of the IHR? So I think we had left at least with those three questions of the environment and health, the One Health question, the overcoming the colonial legacy and the problem in the security model, and then do we need a new treaty, beyond many other more specific questions that came. Melanie, you when you said that the question about how does the pandemic end, so I thought that in Israel now we are almost in this celebratory moment with the vaccination succeeding and everything is reopening, but then we have on one hand what Marco has been talking about, situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And I recalled, and maybe we'll end with this, the quote ending the book La Peste by Camus, which end in saying, indeed, as he listened to the cries of joy that rose above the town, which we may now feel in Tel Aviv and in Israel, Rie recalled that this joy was always under threat. He knew that this happy crowd was unaware of something that one can read in books, which is that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely, that it can remain dormant for dozens of years in furniture or clothing, that it waits patiently in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs, and old papers, and that perhaps a day will come when for the instruction or misfortune of mankind, the plague will rouse its rats and send them to die in some well-contented city. So I'm sorry to end on this less optimistic note, but I think it's something to consider. So thank you again, everyone, for participating. There will be a video recording available if you want to watch it again or send your friends. So if you will put it up on Twitter and etc. And thank you very much. And you're all welcome to join us every week in the international workshop where we discuss other matters. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nazma Dirzadeh from Harvard Law School. That's next week, so you're welcome to join our guests and students. We will see you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.